I think I'm going to use our conversation now as the opening, the cold opening for your interview.
Oh, that's a lot of pressure.
Well, it's not a lot of pressure because you brought up some valid points in the email that you sent to me. I was speaking to you about you winning the first prize for your project at the Museum of Modern Art PS1, the Courtyard project.
Right,
And I think I might have said that the structure that you built was the spelling of wall upside down. And
right.
then you sent me an image showing that you put a lot more thought into it than what I was saying. Is that true?
Yes, I would say so, yeah.
Then the other thing was we were speaking about sustainability.
I don't have any idea of sustainability. Let's start with that.
What would you call
Um, I would call it the relationship between the built object and its environment,
it? Hmm.
which I think is really important. I mean, I used the example when we spoke last time, and I use the example often of the giraffe. Could be any animal, but the giraffe is kind of graphic because of its extended neck.
Hmm.
So I use the example of the fact that in order to survive, the giraffe, at least in concept, not consciously, but over through the period of evolution, has kind of stretched his neck up towards the juicy branches at the top of the tree that nobody else can reach. And that survival for the giraffe creates a kind of formal, um, uh, has a formal consequence that also has a systematic consequence, which is, for example, the heart has to get a lot bigger. And so that's the kind of model that I'm interested in for architecture that you might call sustainability, or, I've just called the relationship with the environment, which is not so much about, and I've been thinking about it in the last few weeks since we talked. It's not so much about the need of the giraffe, so much as the desire. So I think they're two different things. So it's not about functionalism, I would say. And I can elaborate more on what I mean by the difference in architecture. And it's also not really what I'm interested in is not sustainability itself, but the communication of the idea of the stretching of the neck. So if you're looking at this architectural animal, that kind of monstrosity, the strange form of the oversized neck in this case, that should communicate that there's something other than the object to look at,
Hmm.
something about the environment that has caused that, which of course has a consequence in terms of the survival of the either animal or environment. But the goal is not that the functionality or the sustainability. The goal is the communication of that gesture, and by as a side effect, it might do those other things, but that's not the primary intention. And I
But
think in a lot of architecture, the primary intention is either aesthetic or sustainable, and it's basically one or the other. The aesthetic means that the relationship with the environment is secondary,
mm,
and so it looks like something. So it might do the thing, but it doesn't look like it's doing a thing.
okay, so yeah, and that's a perfect example. The perfect example you gave when we discussed it at first was the idea of the sort of the glass skyscraper,
Mm-hmm.
and that architects sometimes they go, all right, well, we're going to do a glass skyscraper, and then we'll shove in the relationship to the environment afterwards.
Right, exactly.
How do you bring architects around to architects and now more sophisticated clients away from that notion that this should be part and parcel of just doing architecture in general. It's not a special thing. How
Right.
do you make that argument?
I mean, I don't know how to make that argument if the starting point for the client is that they want to be sustainable, because, like you say, it should be part of a basic part of architecture. I mean, Vitruvius talked about sustainability in the earliest ever text, but for him as well, it's a secondary concern after aesthetic. But I would say sustainability is not. a style. It doesn't say anything. It says something about what the building does or how it works, but it doesn't help you to make architecture that has an effect on you, kind of on your feelings or your conceptual thinking or your emotions. So I think my job, first of all, is to make good architecture,
Hmm.
and hopefully, primary for me is an architecture that makes people kind of conscious of their place in the world. And of course, it has to do all those things, but it can't be the primary means of communication for an architect. Otherwise, we will still have a world, but it would be miserable to live in it.
So I'm gonna wrap it up, and I'm gonna ask you. I was thinking about this before I sat down. You're there in Rome, and you're teaching. What courses are you teaching?
I'm teaching architecture studio in Rome, so it's pretty interesting because it's uh, contemporary design. I mean, we
Hmm.
teach design which is happening now, it's
Yes.
fresh, but in a very old city. Um, and it's really interesting. We're looking at the seven consular roads of Rome, and the students are analyzing the 25 kilometers from the center of Rome out to the periphery, which means that they have to deal with the ancient Rome and also all of the developments that have happened up until the present day with the expansion. So
Oh
they deal
boy.
with a lot of layers of time. It's really like a tree.
Yes.
And so it's been really interesting. And then they find a kind of a personality or a character of their particular road, and as they zoom in, try to design based on the qualities that they find in that strip of land.
Hmm.
So it's really interesting because we're getting to know the city, not just the ancient city that normally people get to know, but
Hmm.
this whole kind of
The
different
evolution of the
populations
city.
and different times.
Hmm.
So it's really great. And yeah, I mean, I'm teaching here with it's a Cornell and Rome program, so it's the same group of students that have been at Cornell and they're here now, and
Hmm.
will go back to Cornell.
Right.
So it's really, on one hand, a continuation of what I normally do, but in a completely new environment.
How do you prevent the student? Because you, when you're learning as an architecture student, you tend to mimic.
Hmm.
And in a lot of ways, you mimic what's around you. How do you prevent them from just mimicking, you know, ancient buildings uh, or sort of aspects of buildings and just sort of throwing them in there?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this because I've been watching the students, as we travel around, not just in Rome, but we've been in Sicily and we've been in Milan, and the students are making beautiful sketches of these Renaissance and ancient structures, and they're beautiful sketches. But I'm thinking, you know, this cannot be translated into their design. I mean, that would be a difficult problem for me to deal with. So we've talked about a lot, and I've thought about a lot the kind of constants of architecture, the things that are to be found in very old designs that are still present today and still important.
Hmm.
And that's actually a pretty exciting realization that it's not, if you kind of strip away those things that are the ornament and whatever else is related to the style, there are still really fundamental things that are still really important in architecture. I mean, there are a lot of things like the way, how do you deal with a corner, which is in a Roman building, and we've looked at Greek temples too, which are the opposite. How do you turn a corner in architecture, and how have these things been thought about before? Not in order to repeat them, but what are the principles that you could consider? How do, even at the urban scale, how do buildings kind of have a dialogue with each other, even buildings that were built at two different times?
Mm.
And so, if you can get beyond the superficial and really get to the meat of the architecture and the concept that the architect was hoping to communicate, then I think it's much easier to kind of distill that into something that's still really useful today.
All right. Well, I'm going to leave it there, Carolyn. Thank you so much for
That's
calling back.
a pleasure. Nice to talk to you again.